Welcome back to the GAPcast. My name is Guillermo, here to provide you with a neuroscientific perspective on pop psychology. Here with my co-hosts.
How's it going? I'm Abraham. Welcome to the GAPcast. I'm here to be filled with knowledge.
My name is Peter. I'll be offering the pop psychology and some examples to go along with it. And on a second note, can there be more than two hosts or one host? I mean, does that make us just associates?
Co-hosts. That means we're all hosts. That just means we're all I'm a co-host, you're a co-host.
I feel like that just takes away from the title of being host.
Okay. All right, where are we? Today on this episode, we're going to talk about coping mechanisms, the past literature, and what modern psychology says on it today. All right, Peter, what do you have for us?
All right, so the first time we'll be talking about is from Psych Central. One of the most primitive forms of cope mechanisms will involve denial. Denial is basically just a refusal to accept reality or fact. In other words, it's also one of the first 5 stages of grief. From denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance.
Yeah, so there's something interesting. People think that the stages of grief, they're sequential, that you experience them in the order Peter just mentioned, but they're not. For a lot of people, you experience the stages at the same time or in different orders completely. And sometimes you'll literally repeat a stage. So if you're experiencing grief, and you don't experience denial first, let's say first you feel angry, it's not because you're weird. It's just because the human mind deals with grief differently. And the way what Peter mentioned specifically about denial in modern psychology is currently called disengagement coping. And this is considered a primitive form of coping because it can actually lead to a higher incidence of depression. And we'll get more into why later on once we talk about more coping mechanisms. But for now, Peter, what else do you have for us?
Next one is acting out. Now, acting out, once again, you should already know, it's when you just do extreme different behaviors, just to express a thought or something that you can't really properly vocabulate.
Express would probably be better in vocabulary. So acting out is kind of like a desperate bid for attention. It's like, if nobody is refusing to understand you, you feel so desperate that you're just going to lose all sense of social norm and you'll do whatever it takes to get your voice to be heard.
You say that attention call. Would that include things like fishing for compliments and things like that? Would that be considered acting out?
It depends on if they're like stressed, if they're feeling, if that's the way that they cope. Like for instance, if they are very depressed, and they need that attention to alleviate them, that acting out can be in the form of maybe not necessarily like, oh, I'm so good, right? But more like, I'm like, they start bawling or like they just start acting erratically. Not erotically, erratically. Not erotically. Erratically.
But that does lead into one of my questions, which relates with the OnlyFans girls. So,
That's daddy issues. That's another episode. That's daddy issues. What else
daddy
you got?
Issues, okay. That'll be a whole
The next one is going to be disassociation. Now, disassociation, defined by the Psych Central, is when someone just completely loses track of time. They just, they just lose their self. In other words, they basically become a ghost and they just, they become an NPC, in other words.
Yeah, so this one's actually quite serious. Disassociation, you guys have heard of split personality disorder, right, before?
Yes,
like the movie Split.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So that used to be what the medical definition was for it. But then in the new psychology handbook, the DSM-5, they changed it to call it dissociative identity disorder. And that's pretty much the same thing as split personality disorder, but they changed it because it's not that you have different personalities. It's that your mind is disassociating from reality to be able to cope with the stressor. And this happens because if a situation is just so immensely stressful, so you've been under so much trauma, that the mind has to shield itself from that trauma. And it does that by forming different personalities so that way each one is not fully aware of the extent of the trauma. And that's when you see the manifestation of different personalities.
What happens to me whenever something dramatic happens? I'll just be like, I blame that on the script. Oh, what's that? She died of cancer? Man, terrible writing. Poor writing.
Actually, no, speaking of blaming, can you blame some kind of crime based on another personality?
Okay, so this would fall under the domain of forensic psychiatry. So for instance, if you did commit a crime and you were legitimately a different personality, you do have dissociative identity disorder, it would be a legitimate excuse to say that it wasn't you. And you wouldn't go to like prison, but you would probably go to a psychiatric institution.
Oh, so that's a lot worse.
Yeah,
well,
so
no worries. The next one is even worse. It's going to be called Compartmentalization. Yes, that's what it says.
Exactly, you got
Anyways,
it.
like compartmentalization is a lesser form of disassociation. In other words, I can't really explain it, so maybe hopefully you can pass on with this one. But I can give you an example. Uh, Once again, it gives an example of how an honest person can cheat on their income tax returns, but actually be trustworthy when it comes to financial dealings. And other examples involve how a doctor can be religious, but when they have to practice in the actual hospital, they can't let religion take into place. They have to completely separate that. And when compartmentalization is basically just separating different ideas to hold different beliefs. It's kind of like a double think.
Yeah, so that's compartmentalization is actually one of the healthier coping mechanisms. For instance, let's say you're a cop and you witness like a murder, like you see it happen in front of you, but you're also a detective, so you need to investigate it. What you have to do is you have to separate your emotion from the job. So what you do there is you compartmentalize what happened. You're temporarily putting it aside so you can deal with the situation at hand. And compartmentalization is good in the sense that it lets you work on the task at hand. But then if you keep compartmentalizing it, eventually you get to something called repression, which is another coping mechanism. But repression isn't a good thing because when you repress, that's something called it's a kind of a form of emotional denial. And in modern psychology, it's called emotional non-acceptance. And the problem with this type of coping is that it actually leads to a higher incidence of PTSD. So there has to be a fine line between repressing and compartmentalizing. Eventually, you have to acknowledge what happened.
So Pon far.
What's up?
No, wait, that's not Pon far. No, that's it's Star Trek. It's I
Star
want to
Trek.
barf up some Star Trek stuff. Mr. Spock, he's a Vulcan. The Vulcans don't have emotions. I mean, they control their emotions, right?
Uh-huh.
Because back then when they were barbarians, they used to rip people's spines out and display them as trophies or something like that. And then they're like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that. And then they decided to become a peaceful race, and then they made starships and everything, and they got
Just
to
like
boss
that.
around humanity for a little bit, and then they stopped doing that. And then we got Mr. Spock, and he's great. And I can't remember what it's called. It's called
Compartmentalization.
it's called compartmentalization. That's the Vulcan ritual of deleting all your emotion.
Actually, it's deleting all emotions is kind of a form of denial.
Inhumane.
They do accept that they are capable of emotion, and they are capable of situation. They are aware of situations where emotion pops out, but they just go, "No, I'm going to handle this logically."
That's good. So that's a good approach to things. However, denying that you have emotions altogether is a
That is
form of
actually
denial.
not a good idea.
Yeah.
It is not. I actually deny you on that one, Guillermo. It moves on to my further assessments. Down the when it becomes less primitive and more mature defense mechanism, but still coping mechanism nonetheless. But before we get there, let's talk about projection. One of the more common themes you see, most likely in high school. Projection is the misinterpretation of a person's undesired thoughts, feelings, or impulses into another person. So what that means is basically that you're going to do everything that you hate about yourself into the other person.
So
For
you
example,
said
if you're afraid of
projection,
being
not rejection.
judged. No,
Yeah.
projection.
Projection.
No, not projection. Also in high school. Yes, rejection is also found in high school, but
Yeah, that is true.
no more.
You didn't like my name, so I'm going to take it out on everyone else.
But yes,
Exactly right.
projection is a coping mechanism. It's not a healthy one. It's just something that people do. You hear it commonly with cheaters. You know how you say that never trust a cheater. A cheater never trusts their partner because they're cheaters, right? That's what they're doing. They're projecting their feelings of guilt on them from themselves onto their partner. So they're assuming that their partner must be cheating because they are.
Moving on is going to be along reaction formation. Reaction formation is the converting of unwanted dangerous thoughts and feeling impulses into their opposites. In other words, an example of this is that if you are pissed off at your boss and you absolutely hate his guts, you're just acting really nice around him and you'll be very supportive and you'll pretend like you just absolutely adore him, even though it makes no sense.
Yeah, reaction formation is a pretty paradoxical one. I also heard this example where you hate your neighbor's guts too, but you bake them cookies. So, because like you're just trying, it's also kind of a slight form of denial. You know you hate them, but also you don't want to manifest it because it's socially unacceptable. So you do the complete opposite of it.
I guess when you're baking them cookies, there is the fun thought of, I could put arsenic in here, but I can't do that. But I'll enjoy that thought.
Fantasies. That's actually another coping mechanism. Fantasies, but that's for another conversation.
I mean, you watch
Oh, that's
you
so
watch him eat the
sad.
cookies, and
So
you're like, I hope you
for
freaking
any
choke on
daydreamer
it.
out there, they just look repressed and depressed and all that
Well,
jazz.
actually, this one's interesting. I read a study that said that nostalgic remembering, depending on the person, can cause them either to be depressed or it can actually make them feel better about themselves. And this has something to do with the way that the person is. If the person already has anxiety and they tend to ruminate, that is, they constantly focus on bad stuff that happens, and then they start being nostalgic, what that might be doing is that it might be maladaptive. So they might just be going over the past over and over and start saying, what if, what could have happened? And it can also be a bad coping mechanism because they're escaping from reality. But if you are good, if you're mentally healthy and you have nostalgic remembering, that can actually increase positive self-regard and it can strengthen your interpersonal connectivity.
Putting Spock, he really puts an analytical mind to it. We call that intellectualization. Intellectualization is putting overemphasis on thinking because you refrain from feeling it emotionally because you're actually afraid of it. So in other words, when it's an example of that will most likely come from the Institute of Clinical Hypnosis, says that Freud involves engrossing oneself to deeply into the reasoning aspect of a situation that you completely disregarded the emotional aspect that is involved. Which basically, in other words, a good example is that when you go to the doctor and you go to the hospital and he gives you horrible news, you try to overanalyze it and you're like, okay, then well, let me call back to the insurance companies and bring up how much chemotherapy will cost and all that jazz. You're making assumptions, trying to find the most analytical way to approach the situation, though not because you're trying to find a solution, but because you're trying to away from your own emotions.
Yeah, so intellectual. Oh, no, I can pronounce that word. Intellectualization. Depending on how you use it. For instance, if it helps you deal with this difficult situation like cancer, and then eventually you confront your emotions later on, that's okay. Then it's not a form of denial. But sometimes you can intellectualize. In modern psychology, we call that primary control coping, and that's attempting to directly control a situation, right? And that's kind of like a logical thing. Some people it works well. For other people, it doesn't. This all boils down to the individual. So it's just really it's not really a catch-all. We can't say intellectualization is bad or good. It just depends on the context and the individual that's using it. Mm-hmm.
So you know that one pompous dick in high school, and on the one that goes like, "Well, actually, so is he actually depressed?" And I'm like, "You just."
I don't know. You tell us, Peter.
I wouldn't say depressed. I would just say that
Joke. It's a joke.
Rationalization. Rationalization is putting something into a different light and offering a different explanation for one's perceptions and behaviors in the face of a changing reality. An example they gave us is that let's say you're going on a first date with some guy. You think he's absolutely amazing. I don't know why I said guy. What I meant to say is you
Because
go
we
on
all
this
love
first date
guys.
with a woman, and she is absolutely wonderful. She's amazing and she's great.
Go
And
back to
then
guys.
she never calls you back. And you
Say
just think to
he.
yourself, I knew she was a bitch the entire time.
He.
That is no, don't impose your
Go back to
homosexuality
he.
at
Your
me.
sexuality.
It's
So I knew she was a bitch. I wouldn't. It's hard to say that's rationalization. I could think of rationalization better in the context of like the reason that she didn't call me is because she was a bitch. That's probably rationalization. It's because she was a bitch.
That's such a nice guy thing to
Why
say.
doesn't mommy want to
Like,
see me
oh my
anymore?
god,
Your mother's a
you
bitch.
guys.
It's not a good mechanism. I'm not saying it's a good mechanism, but that's definitely rationalization. She didn't call me because she is a bitch. It's not me. It's her. Things like that.
No, of
Deductive
course, it's always
reasoning.
her. Never else,
It's
right?
always her. It's always yeah. That's a form of rationalization. Anyway, what else?
Undoing is the attempt to take back an unconscious behavior or thought that is unacceptable or hurtful. The example they give us is that if you, I don't know, you say something very hurtful to your significant other or maybe a close friend, and then immediately you start giving them praise nonstop to hopefully reverse any damage that you've done. So you call someone stupid and you see that it hurts them. You want to call them smart, brilliant. You're like, hey there, smart guy. And then, just constantly try and bring them up, hopefully to reverse anything.
I have a
What was this
question.
coping mechanism called?
Undoing.
Undoing. Okay.
undoing. So if someone calls a person a smart guy, they're gonna be like, "Oh, I'm just gonna become smarter." Is that what you just said?
No, that's going to be, I believe that's called self-fulfilling prophecy, where if you believe something to be constantly true, eventually you'll fit a personality that will make that outcome happen.
It's really cool. So basically, it's basically you're walking back what you said because you feel guilty, kind of. It's kind of like a
Bada
self-guilt trip.
boom.
Yeah, that's cool. I
I
didn't
do
know
have a
about that.
question on this, and hopefully
Uh-huh.
you guys can help me out when it comes to doing this and think whether or not it applies to this exact scenario, or if maybe it's something completely different.
Okay.
Now, let's say you do something wrong. Let's say you mess up and you spill a coffee on somebody. What happens if you allow yourself to constantly be beat up because you feel like you deserve it? Would that be considered as undoing? Because we need to know something like that. I'm picking that exact scenario because that's exactly what happened. A fellow school classmate of ours one time spilled coffee, and you notice that she beat herself up for it. And someone called her stupid, and she would just be like, "Yeah, yeah, I am stupid. I'm an idiot," and then she'll just reaffirm it, and she'll humiliate herself
Because she'd walk
just
over
because.
herself. If she can walk over herself,
Yeah. So let me get into that. So this is actually a thought pattern that leads to anxiety and depression. So this is something called global thinking. So
Should we call it?
whenever we have blame, right? We can say something like, "I did this because I'm an idiot." But then there's local thinking. It's like, "Oh, I just made a mistake." But when people studies have shown that having global thinking, global blame, you tend to attribute everything that goes wrong to you being bad
yeah,
at
yeah.
everything, and that in turn leads to anxiety and then depression.
And what
So
was the
I'm not.
name?
So that's global thinking right there.
Global thinking.
Global thinking, yeah, global thinking. So it's a thought pattern. Thankfully, this is a thought pattern that can be changed with therapy, and so people can get over it. But it's still something very pervasive. So whenever you get into like a situation and you make a mistake, don't say I'm an idiot, because after enough time, eventually you start to believe it. Instead, just say I made a mistake, because we all make mistakes. And that's everything we have for this episode of the GAPcast. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Guillermo.
I'll later see you later.
And Abraham, I can't understand anything you said.
I'm Abraham.
And my name is Peter. All right. And I think, hey guys, thank you all for joining us. See you next week. Bye.